honestly, I just searched building a wall. I was like, that looks. Good morning. Welcome to my class on rebuilding retaining walls. Just kidding. We are going to be in the book of Nehemiah this quarter, and I'm excited. I've never taught this book here, and I know that I think we've only been through it one time a couple years ago when we were going through the Old Testament, and I think even then when we went through it, we were at home because of COVID, and we were doing it via Zoom, and so hopefully this might be a little more engaging for us all. We can get into the meat of the word of what this book has to teach us. It's so good for so many reasons, and just some context just to get before we get started. The book of Nehemiah is set within the Jewish people's return from Babylonian exile. And then it houses within it the efforts to rebuild Jerusalem, both physically and spiritually. And I don't want us to miss that. I think sometimes we focus just on the wall. That when we think about Nehemiah, we think just about the wall. When we think about Jonah, we just think about the fish. And I don't want us to limit our vision to the material aspect about this, at all. I want us to recognize that this is about rebuilding Jerusalem both physically and spiritually. And more than that, this book serves as a reminder for us of what faith really looks like, what prayer looks like. And most importantly, I think another aspect that we sometimes kind of gloss over is what obedience looks like. At one time, both Ezra and Nehemiah were one book combined. And they were later separated, making Nehemiah then the last of the Old Testament history to be written before the 400 years of silence. Now, it's not the last book to be written. I think Malachi was probably the last text that we have from the Old Testament, but Malachi is prophecy. And so Nehemiah is then the last history record that we have before Christ. And so I think it's just important to realize going into this, the significance of this book, the themes and the principles that are presented in the book, and what it is that we can learn from this great historical account. So the historical and political context before we get into the chapter is that Babylonian exile was taking place. Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and this led to the exile of many Jews into Babylon. Did it lead to the exile of all the Jews? Okay, no, it's just many. Not everybody was exiled, and we'll maybe get into that some while we're going. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC and allowed the Jewish exiles then to return to Jerusalem. And so there's multiple returns that you'll see throughout the Old Testament record too. The first was led by Zerubbabel, and then Joshua, and then the temple's rebuilt. Along with this, you have Ezra that led a subsequent return, focusing on the teaching and the establishing of the law. Again, Ezra and Nehemiah used to be considered one book before they were separated, and so you had this really long account of both the rebuilding of the wall and also Ezra's task of dealing with the law and intermarrying and sort of that thing. And we'll get into some of that even in this book. But then Nehemiah led the third return, and he's tasked with rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. And that's what a lot of this book is focused on. And again, I don't want us to miss the spiritual aspects of this book as well. Nehemiah's position, he was a high-ranking official, the cupbearer. I think sometimes we hear the term cupbearer and we think, well, that's kind of low man on the totem pole. But any idea what kind of significance that position holds? Yes, ma'am. Life or death. Yeah, the cupbearer had a stressful job. What does the cupbearer have to do? Does he just bring the cup? You got to be the first one to drink it, right? So this literally is a high-pressure job that he has there. And evidently, he was pretty successful at it because he didn't die. In this, he is the cupbearer to the king, and we know the king, and I never can pronounce this right, Artaxerxes. my dyslexic mind, when I read that, I want to say something else, but I know that it's Artaxerxes, and so I have to remind myself. But this is sort of the historical and the political context of what's going on here. And not that it matters too much, but when we get into reading the chapter, we're going to see that this is taking place. When we get into chapter 1, where this is taking place, it's going to tell us what month is taking place. And the significance with that is the month of Chislev. And Chislev is the third month of the Jewish civil year, but it's the ninth month of the spiritual year. The Jewish calendar was very different than ours. Based on the Gregorian calendar, which we still access, it would have been around November, December, sort of toward the end of our year. But with the Jews, it was different. They had two different calendars. They had a physical calendar, which would have been the third month, and a spiritual calendar, which would have put them in the ninth month. And I'm just saying all that to say that all that holds significance into what's happening in this first chapter. But these are the key issues we're going to look at in this study for this next quarter, is rebuilding. I think there's a lot that we can learn about rebuilding. And I'm not necessarily thinking about just physically rebuilding something, but when something is broken, whether it's a system, whether it's an organization, whether it's you can even break it down into micro topics like your faith. Like sometimes you have to rebuild your faith. Sometimes you have to rebuild your passion for the Lord. I mean, there's a lot of things that could need rebuilding, and I think this book gives us a blueprint for all that. But we're also going to look at in terms of leadership. Think about the leadership that takes place in this task of rebuilding the wall, that there can't be a break in the ranks when it comes to this monumental task. Well, there's a lot involved here, and we're going to see as we study this quarter, there's a lot of things going on in this thing, and one of those things is going to be opposition. But most importantly, we're going to cover faith and obedience, that we understand those two things are directly connected. To have true faith, what does the book of James tell us about true faith? You know my faith by what? By my works, right? You'll know my faith by my works, that my faith will produce fruit. That faith is not something that's stagnant. It's not something that we just say we have. Faith is action. If I profess to have faith, that is going to be visible in the things that I do. And we're going to see a lot of that with Nehemiah in this chapter. And then again, the opposition. The reason that faith and obedience and this aspect of leadership are so important is because they're not just rebuilding a wall. That's not going to be an easy task in and of itself. I mean, how big is this wall? Where does it go?
It's the wall around the city and the temple, and these stones are not like something you meet or lance to pick up. You're talking about something that takes several men, equipment, or animals to move.
Yeah, so this isn't like a retaining wall in your backyard. This is a wall that's going to encompass a city that has to be completed. It's also designed for protection. So like you said, David, these aren't just going to be little 12 by 12 stones. These are going to be large stones put in place, mortared in, fortified, right? The whole purpose of having a wall around your city was for protection, right? And so you don't want to build a wall that's flimsy that your enemy can just come up and just kick one side of it over and walk on through. You want this to be something that's going to help keep them out. So that even catapults, and boulders being shot from catapults will withstand some hits before it just lets people march in. A wall in this sense is extremely important. And I think there's a spiritual aspect for that, for us too, that we're going to consider. And so the opposition was great, right? They were doing a task that was already difficult, but now you've also got people opposing you while you're doing it. It's kind of like roofing. That's what I tell people. Everybody asks why roofing is so expensive. And I was like, imagine that you're rock climbing. and then somebody hands you a nail gun and a bundle of shingles. That's why it's expensive. It's not the material as much as it is the labor. Those guys have a difficult and dangerous job. And then throw some 100-degree temps on it, all the worse. And then finally, the last of the key issues that we're going to see in this whole study is covenant. Why is that important? What is it about covenant that draws some significance? What is a covenant? It's an agreement or pact. I heard something else. Huh? It's a promise. Okay, covenant is absolutely paramount. And it's gonna largely factor into what we're going to see as we study this book. That this is a key issue, and it matters greatly, especially when we consider our own covenant with God. Are we under a covenant? Yes. Okay, we're under the new covenant, right? The New Testament. But seeing how important this was to Nehemiah, and how essential it was to the rebuilding of Jerusalem, both physically and spiritually, there's a lot of lessons in here for us. And I'm going to do my best to keep us on track. This book has 13 chapters. There's 13 weeks in the quarter. I'm already a week behind, I think. Or am I? I don't know. I think I'm already a week behind. But anyway, I know this. I'm going to do my best to not veer off too much, but there is so much here for us to look at, and I want to do my best to try to keep us moving. But, Tino?
Yeah, don't be in a rush, brother.
All right.
This is, we're not in a hurry to get somewhere.
All right.
This is good. But let me just make
Yeah, go ahead.
observations. This is very important, right? Physically, it was a promise that was made by God.
Yeah.
You're going to be oppressed. I will bring you back.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the end. This is the fulfillment of that promise. But then, as you read the Old Testament, you begin to look, where's Christ in all this, right? What do we get out of it? Where is Christ? And if you dig a little bit deeper, I still haven't gotten that worked out in my mind yet. But you have a king, Zerubbabel, right? Nehemiah may actually be a prophet. And then Ezra is a priest.
Yeah.
Right? And so those titles belong to, guess who?
That's right. Jesus.
Yeah. And so all these men are fulfilling a role that God has planned for them. And we can see Christ in this,
That's right.
in this day.
And what you said, I think, is really important for us to note, too, before we move on into the chapter. They were promised, right? We go back to Jeremiah. For I, the Lord, have plans for you to prosper you, right? That's a verse taken way out of context in modern times. Everybody thinks that's about them. Well, when you consider what that promise was really about, you don't want Jeremiah's promise, because that promise was about what Tino just brought up. He promised them, you're going to be taken into captivity. You're going to be oppressed. You're going to be taken away from your home. The temple's going to be, all these things are promised. But part of that promise, too, was that he was going to bring them back. And what we're seeing in Nehemiah is just that, the fulfilling of God's promise. And so, great detail to point out. Any other thoughts before we get started? Because we got to read 11 verses, and I want to try to get into my material if I can. But I'm going to take Tino's admonition. I'm not going to rush. Go ahead, Tara.
I was just going to say that he had an important position, but he was an ordinary person. So God was using not a priest or a prophet. He was using someone that was an ordinary person to accomplish this great task.
Absolutely.
And we can learn from that. Sometimes we feel ordinary and out of place, but there's always a big job to do in the kingdom.
That's right.
It takes everyone doing something.
Absolutely. Good point. Everybody can be involved, right? I think sometimes you're right. I think we place a lot of importance on preachers or elders or deacons even. But the truth is those are just titles. And at the end of the day, I might be one of the preachers here, but I'm just a guy too. I'm no different than anybody else. I have a different role and responsibility. But the truth is, I'm an everyday guy too. And just like everyone here, we can all be involved in this work. And that's a great detail to point out. Yes, sir.
One of the things to remember, this is real history. This is not just a story.
That's right, it is.
This is real history. These are real people, historical figures. I mean, there's archaeological evidence, all kind of things. These are real things. And so with that in mind, I've always marveled at the fact that whether it's Cyrus before or now Artaxerxes or I think his father was Ahasuerus with Esther. And so you've got all these figures. Why should they give the Jews any favor? I mean, because their kingdoms were vast. I mean, they were full of people, all kinds of religions. These are pagan kings. I mean, these aren't Christian kings. They're all the gods that they worship. Why give the Jews any favor? So to me, that just reminds me, this is God's story, and this is the hand of God upon His people, fulfilling that promise.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, why would they?
Yeah.
Why would they? Cyrus is even named in the Bible.
Right.
God, what was he? Cyrus, my shepherd. I think.
That's one of the things I love about all the genealogies. I know that we sometimes avoid 1st and 2nd Chronicles, right? Those first couple chapters, because they're chock full of names that none of us can pronounce. But those were real people. That's what I love about the genealogies, is they give us a historical document of people that lived and existed, right? And were known. And same thing with the genealogies in the gospel. Those are really important because it proves that these were real people that can be verified, and that's such a faith builder. Anything else?
Just like our covenant, Nehemiah reminds us God made this covenant, but it was their actions that caused them to break us and lost those promises. But He will keep His promises if you come back. As Jesus told them, you test to keep, if you obey, you will keep my commandments.
That's right. So the renewal of this covenant was emphasizing the people's commitment, right, to return to the relationship with Him. That's a good point.
And to add to that, the covenant, He reminds them that's their motivation. And He stirs the hearts of these good people so they'll try harder.
Yeah. Absolutely. Good points. Let's get into chapter 1, and we'll answer that question once we read through it. Just open your Bibles. It's 11 verses, and I'm gonna take my time and read through it. I want to make sure that we're getting everything out of it that we can before we ask some questions that point us in some directions. Chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, and I was in Susa, the capital. And Hanani was one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came and asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and remained in captivity about Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who remain from captivity are in great calamity and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Now it happened that when I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I beseech you, O Yahweh, God of heaven, the great and fearsome God, who keeps the covenant and loving kindness for those who love Him and keep His commandments. Let your ear now be attentive to your eyes, and hear my prayer of your slave, which I am praying before you today and on night, in behalf of the sons of Israel, your slaves, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. We have worked in utter destruction against you, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments which you've commanded to your servant Moses. Remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are faithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been banished were at the ends of the sky, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. They are your slaves and your people, whom you redeemed by your great power and your strong hand. O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your slave and the prayer of your slaves who delight and fear your name, and make your slave successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. Now I was a cupbearer of the king. This whole chapter is basically a prayer. nearly the whole thing. But when we're first introduced, where is Nehemiah when he receives this news about Jerusalem? Say again? Okay. Where is that?
In Persia.
It's in Persia.
Modern day Iran.
Yeah, so it's in modern day Iran. Not real close to Jerusalem, but not real far away from home, but a hike, right? I mean, he's not just right next door. This is not a close proximity venture. But he's not at home. He's part of the Persian kingdom. And so he hears this news about his home, and you know, we're going to look at this more, but what was his role again? Cupbearer, right? So he makes that known. And why was he there? Why, you know, what's going on with him there that's put him in this place?
There was select in that first exile to Babylon.
Okay.
70 years. The best of the best.
All right, so this tells you a little bit about Nehemiah before we even get into this book. He was handpicked for this role. This wasn't just that he was a slave to the Persian Empire and they just brought him in and kind of threw him into this position. He was picked. He was selected, best of the best. And that tells you something automatically about what kind of man Nehemiah is. And so he's there under the captivity in exile. But what's the state of Jerusalem and its people at this time? What is it that he's told?
To destroy and then.
Yes, in ruin. It's in ruin. Did he not know this? Yeah, again, you're separated from your home. But you can be well aware, to some degree, that things aren't great back there. But this news comes and it's direct. And it sets him on a path to the beginning of this book. So notice his response. How did he respond?
He wept. I mean, that he, you know, I think it's verse 4, yes it is, where he knew of that destruction of Jerusalem, and so he was grieved in his heart. But are you asking after that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just the initial reaction. His initial reaction is immediately he's grieved. Immediately he's grieved. But why? Why would Nehemiah weep and mourn and fast and pray over something that he knew was probably already happening?
Well, he was probably, all the people back then in captivity were hopeful because they'd been movement.
Yeah.
Right? 20 years before, somebody had already gone. Zerubbabel led the first,
Yeah, in his mind, yeah.
And so they were building, they were working there, so they were hopeful that things were going well.
This is a great example of out of sight, out of mind, right? He knew that Zerubbabel had gone back. He just assumed rebuilding is taking place. Everything's probably going to be great. We're going to get to go home soon. Rob?
They probably read the scriptures too, knowing that God has promised that He leads. They have that knowledge.
Yeah, so this really takes the wind out of your sails. You know, if you're Nehemiah, you're serving every day in this kind of high-pressure position. You're doing your best. You're not able to go back and do anything, but you know that there are other people back there doing things. And so in your mind, you've got, sometimes we build things up in our mind, don't we? We have an idea of something or we picture something that we think to be happening. And so when you get this news, and it's not what you thought. Progress has not been made. That's right. Don.
And think about it, if he was taken to the first captivity along with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those guys, they wouldn't have seen the final destruction, which didn't come for, 20 or 30 years later, 586, I guess.
You're right.
So even, assuming he heard reports of what had happened and those kinds of things, he may not have seen, and there's a big difference between seeing the destruction and hearing about it. And so maybe the reports he was getting were more vivid, and again, it's already been said, the rebuilding that was not taking place and the emotions that would have come with that. And also knowing, I mean, obviously he's a faithful man, so knowing that this was the city where God would put his name, I think he makes mention of that. So there's that connection as well, you know, spiritual, emotional, to this is God's place that is in ruin.
That's right. Yes, ma'am.
But your second question there really relates back strongly to the first question.
It does.
From the emotional point of view, the fasting and the praying, I mean, says a great deal, not just from a spiritual point of view, but what you're giving to the Lord in that physical omission.
That's
Does that
right.
make sense?
Well, that brings my third question. What does Nehemiah's reaction reveal about his character? What kind of man is he?
Man of God.
He is a man of God through and through. Now think about it. How long has he been in Persia? If he was taken in that first captivity,
Pretty close to 7 years.
been there a long time. So is Nehemiah a young guy?
All we can get is guess, he may be middle-aged or a lot.
He's definitely middle-aged, maybe older. Probably older. He's not a young guy. He's lived the majority of his life away from Jerusalem. And yet he is faithful. Now, you know, I think sometimes it's hard for us to identify with this because we live within, you know, driving distance of how many congregations? I mean, dozens. I mean, even this morning, you know, Cole is preaching up at Wheelers Grove, and that's like, you know, we were pulling up the address for him, and I was like, okay, it's an hour, you better go. An hour. We think, oh man, an hour. It's not that big of a deal, really. You can hop in your car and get right up there. But he's essentially lived the majority of his adult life away from his spiritual home in Jerusalem. And so to see this kind of reaction tells you exactly what kind of man Nehemiah is. Tina?
Yeah, it's very long. And I believe, could be wrong, but Zerubbabel went back 50 years into captivity.
Yeah.
To rebuild. Now, 10 years later, Ezra and Nehemiah right around that time. So they've been there close to 7 years.
Long time.
That's a long time. And they were taken as teenagers.
Right. They're old men.
Old men.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point too.
It seems like, you know, I don't think he's that old. I would say he's middle-aged, because he may have been born there as long as captivity else battle now.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Paul, though, when he was told about some of the churches that were not doing well. He called my little children, he read what and prayed for them.
Yeah. And so think about this from a personal application. Do we get grieved when we hear about spiritual failings? Are we grieved whenever we hear about maybe someone, even something that someone has fallen away? Are we grieved to the point that we would weep and mourn or fast even? Again, I think sometimes it's out of sight, out of mind. It doesn't affect us. It's not my problem. But this gives us a great example of how deeply concerned we ought to be about the kingdom as a whole. That it is a big deal. Anytime somebody falls away, it is a big deal. And anytime there's some sort of you know, travesty somewhere in the church, it's all a big deal. It all matters, and we should all be concerned about the kingdom as a whole. Something that, you know, I know we and I don't even want to say I'm guilty of this. I know that this is just how things are. We get focused on right here. But there's a kingdom to be worked in. You know, and I think we rightfully so, we focus here and we put our efforts here. But at large, whenever Rest brings up things that are going on in Africa, those are things that we should care about. Those are things that we should, if we're able to, get involved with. Right? And Nehemiah gives us a great example of a man who, as far as we can tell, has not set foot in his home, if ever, in at least 70 years. And so being out of sight, out of mind doesn't excuse us from caring about those things. And so we know that Nehemiah is a praying man, he's a religious man, and he is a dedicated man of God. So what does Nehemiah acknowledge then about God in his prayer? Look at verse 5. Look at how he acknowledges God. He says, I beseech you, O Yahweh, the God of heaven, the great and fearsome God, who keeps the covenant in loving kindness for those who love him and his commandments. There's a lot there. What's the first thing that comes to mind? The way that he addresses God, the attributes that he proclaims about God.
Great and awesome.
So great and awesome. What else?
Mercy.
Merciful. What else? Paula, you saying something?
I said merciful.
Okay.
It's garmented.
Great, fearsome, who keeps the covenant. What is that? A God who keeps his covenant is a what? Faithful. Right? He's a faithful God. From our study in Hebrews last quarter, we know that God keeps his promises. Right? And so Nehemiah acknowledging you're a God who is great and awesome and merciful and faithful. He says he keeps his covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. So he's acknowledging then that covenant relationship, isn't he? He's acknowledging that God keeps his covenant as well. That you take care of your people. And so even though he's hearing about this great calamity that's going on, when he's addressing God, he's like, God, I trust you. You can handle this. I know that you're going to deliver us. And so I'm approaching you, praising you, thanking you for all that you do. But this is in the midst of a horrible situation. You know, anytime tragedy strikes, whether it's a school shooting, or whether it's some sort of bombing, or whether it's some sort of attack, or whether it's any kind of world event, as praying people, and as we should, we will often say we're praying for this situation. And I hope, sidebar, I hope that we really do pray when we say that. We get on social media sometimes and someone tells us about a situation and you see a lot of people say, I'm praying for you. I really hope that if we're saying that, we're doing it. That we're not just simply throwing up the praying hands emoji, which might be comforting for the person reading it, but more than that, I hope we're praying. I hope that we truly are praying for those situations. And so, in this situation, Nehemiah is praying for this. That's really what the rest of this chapter looks like. What does Nehemiah confess in his prayer? What does he say about himself and his people in verses 6 and 7? So he acknowledges how great God is and how faithful God is and how loving God is to the people that keep his commandments. But what does he confess in verses 6 and 7? That they're unfaithful. Right, so right off the heels of telling God how great, how faithful he is, Nehemiah knows that God knows who he is. And Nehemiah knows that God knows who the people of Israel are. And Nehemiah knows that God knows they haven't been faithful. Where's the power in confessing something? Why would you tell God what he already knows?
He still wants to hear it.
Humility. He still wants to hear it. That's the problem with confession. We don't do it. A lot of times we think, well, God knows, I don't have to say it. But there's something powerful about saying something out loud. Right? Or writing it down. There's and this is, I don't know where I got this idea, but I know that in business a lot of times, especially whenever you're trying to come up with something new or put a plan in place, the thought is, if it exists only in your head and hasn't been written down, it doesn't exist yet. Meaning that if the thought is only in my head, but I haven't actually said it or written it down somewhere, it's not real. Right? If I want to put a plan in place, I have to write that plan down. If I have a goal that I want to reach, I need to write it down. I need to say it to someone else. We have a thing called accountability partners. What is that? What's an accountability partner?
So somebody calls you on your stuff.
Yeah. Say, hey, didn't you say this? When we get married, why are the guests at the wedding? Witness of the vow. It's not because we really like you. We want you to buy us nice gifts. We want you to come witness what these two people are confessing to one another. That in the presence of God, I am making a promise to this person through God. That God is part of this equation. But I'm making this solemn promise, and I want all you people here to hear me. Why? Because if I start to fail, somebody needs to get involved. That's really what it's about. When we make vows in a wedding, it's because we want other people to hear those vows and keep us accountable to it. Hold my feet to the fire. If I start becoming a bad husband, call me out. Yes, don't call me a bad husband.
No. Sometimes that lack of, just made me think about this, sometimes that lack of confession masks denial. And so,
man.
we're not confessing because really deep inside we're thinking, it's not really a problem.
Yeah. We don't confess because we don't want people in our business. Right?
Well, as a parent, if you know your kid does something wrong, the control or how they can take it, how do you feel about it?
Oh, I'm furious.
You're disappointed.
I'm disappointed.
Here's the disappointment.
You know, because I'm giving you the chance to come clean, right? And what do we usually say? If you tell me now,
The punishment is easy.
that's right. You're still going to be in trouble, but it ain't going to be that bad. Just tell me the truth.
And God tells us the same thing for us.
It's exactly the same thing. Nehemiah acknowledges that. He says, you're the God, right? You showed loving kindness to those who fear and keep your commandments. By the way, we haven't kept your commandments. Yes, ma'am.
Well, in verse 7, and this is the King James Version, he says, and openly, I'm sure with great emotional strength, we have dealt very corruptly against them. I mean, that very corruptly against Jehovah
Yeah,
is saying a lot.
it is. It is. So that brings me to the next point. Why is it significant then that Nehemiah includes himself and his father's house in this confession of sin? He says we, right? And so, when you say we, you're bringing other people along with you, but you're including yourself, aren't you? And he actually states, me and my father's house. Why is it significant that Nehemiah would include himself and his father's house in this prayer?
Accepting responsibility.
100%. He's not trying to pass blame at all. All right? What happened in the garden? That woman you brought me. She. Right? Adam is automatically trying to pass blame to Eve instead of owning it. Right? But when we go back to that sin, and Satan is there, and he's influencing Eve, she takes the fruit, and then what does she do? Offered it to her husband who was with her, it says. Adam is standing right there. And he knew the command, right? But before Eve is created, God gives Adam the law, right? You can eat any tree in the garden except this one. So before Eve was even created, Adam has the law. Adam's responsibility then is to see to it that his wife knows the law and keeps the law. And yet he's standing right there with her, listening to Satan. She takes the fruit, hands him some, and he eats it. Before she handed it to him, he still had an opportunity to correct things. But he goes right along with it. And so when Nehemiah confesses and he includes himself and his father's house in this horrible business of these horribly corrupt violations of God's law, he takes full responsibility on himself. He's not trying to keep anything back from God. He is coming completely clean. Right? Completely clean. And so it is a true confession of sin. He's not just speaking on behalf of the people, he's speaking for himself in there too. So what does Nehemiah remind God in his prayer relating to God's covenant? What does he remind God of?
Throws himself on the mercy of the court.
All right. He says, remember the word which you commanded. He said, remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, those of you who have been banished were at the ends of the sky, I will gather them from there, and I will bring them to the place where I have chosen you for my name to dwell. So he throws himself on the mercy of the court. He reminds God of his covenant. Do you think that's because God doesn't remember? No, it's not about that. It's not because God doesn't remember. Again, there's power in saying something out loud to maybe remind yourself of that. And I think it's important to note, too, that he mentions Moses, which means what?
Moses was a lawgiver people who had done the same thing every time they had messed up, and God was ready to destroy them. Moses went to them and pleaded for him and the people.
That's why Nehemiah knew he could do this. Yes, ma'am.
This is also about repentance and reconciliation.
Yeah.
He didn't say this prayer. It doesn't use the word repentance, but you know he did.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know that from the very beginning where it says that he's weeping and fasting. Those are typically, associated with repentance. And so when he makes this prayer to God, he's confessing, he's weeping, he's reminding God about, hey, I know that I can come to you because Moses came to you with the same thing. Didn't you tell Moses this? Well, here I am. I'm doing what Moses did.
And that tells me that no matter how times Dave messes up, I still got a chance if I go to him.
Well, you know what's funny about that? That goes all the way back to the garden too, doesn't it? Cain and Abel. When Cain presents his sacrifice to God, which was less than acceptable, what does God tell Cain?
You could have improved.
Try again. Right? If you do well, will you not be accepted? Try again, Cain. Listen, you tried to punt and it shot off the sideline. Try again. He gives him another opportunity to make it right. And we know that Cain doesn't. But still, that's an important reoccurring trait and characteristic of God that we see over and over again, is that God is patient. God is merciful. You can try again. Yes, ma'am.
Well, and even the warning that Jehovah gave, and that masterful lawgiver, Moses figure, in Deuteronomy, he said over and over, again and again, if you do this, in other words, that verse 7, where we dealt very corruptly against thee, it was everything from idols to giving their daughters and their sons in marriage to those in opposition to Jehovah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what specific request does Nehemiah make of God then at the end of the prayer? What does it say in verse 11? Oh Lord, I beseech you. I was about to hear it. Give him favor. Right? He asks specifically for favor. Where do we use that word favor often? Well, think about this. What is grace? It's unmerited favor, right? Hear me. So how does Nehemiah's response to bad news serve as an example for us? When we get bad news, no matter what it is, and I'm sure everybody here is like me, I probably get bad news at least once a day. That's why I don't watch the news anymore, because it's just bad news. I can't deal with it. But in your own life, when we get bad news, how do you deal with it? What does Nehemiah's response serve as an example for us? Pray. Take it to the Lord. Right? There's an example there, and oftentimes prayer is the last place we go. We go to prayer after everything else that I've tried fails. What does that tell you about our works? What's the scripture say? They're but as filthy rags before you. You know that listen, when I get bad news, the first place I should go is prayer. I shouldn't be trying to, I can fix this. Do that after you've prayed. Do what you're going to do after you've prayed, because there's a chance that God is going to help in this situation, whether it's insight from the Bible, whether it's wisdom from a friend, whatever it is, there's power in praying first before we try to get involved with our filthy rags, right? And so Nehemiah gives us a great example of how we deal with trouble when it comes. Go ahead.
Getting mad, throwing up our hands, getting disgusted,
Oh, yeah.
being defeated, or anything else.
Yeah, reaction is usually always negative, right? We're about to be out of time. How can we apply Nehemiah's example of fasting and prayer in our own lives? Is that something that we do? I know we pray, but do we fast?
We should.
We should. That's a whole nother class that we're going to talk about. We should fast, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Last point. What can we learn from Nehemiah's confession of sin? Well, I think first and foremost for me is that it's total and complete. I'm not holding anything back. Sometimes we hold back the details, right? And which is odd when we're confessing to God, holding back detail. He knows. But we hold back the details because even we don't want to say it, right? I hold back details from a confession because even I don't want to hear what I'm about to say, which is all the more reason why we need to confess. Thanks, y'all. We'll be in Nehemiah chapter 2 next Sunday. Thank you so much for class. I'm out. We'll maybe hit these at the beginning of class next week.